Well, hello everyone, thank you for coming. It's a pandemic out there, and I'm glad that a few of us showed up and are appropriately spaced on the couch and in the room. I want to talk today about Atlantis, and how many of you have heard about Atlantis? How many? Raise your hands. There's one. That's only one, two. Good. That's the majority, I would say. It's a funny place. It's a really astounding, fanciful place, and I would like to talk a little bit about it today. Its history and why it got so important to American thinking. And and actually this first slide gives you an example of what people think Atlantis must have looked like. Although we don't have any evidence of that city, this is kind of the magical thought of how it must have looked. And so let's go on and look about the notion of Atlantis. Atlantis has an interesting history, and in fact it begins back with the ancient Greeks in Solon's time, who was a poet about 600 BC. He traveled to Egypt, and there in Alexandria came across some manuscripts that talked about Atlantis having existed about 9,000 years BC, and past the Pillars of Hercules, which I'll talk about a little bit later, and having disappeared in the depths of the sea in some great cataclysm that occurred at the time. Later on, Plato wrote about this in his Critias and Timaeus dialogues, and he mentioned as well the notion of Atlantis having existed past the Pillars of Hercules. So, the first map that shows Atlantis is this one. It's a little differently oriented. South is to the north, to the top, and so they've drawn in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, which is probably the origin of the term Atlantis, an island, the island of Atlantis, outside the gates of the Gibraltar Strait here, with Africa on this side and Spain on this side, somewhere between there and the America that they're beginning to learn about. So that was one of the first maps of where Atlantis must have been. The Pillars of Hercules. This is mentioned several times in the dialogues and in Plato's talk, and later on. So if Atlantis was past the Pillars of Hercules, where were those? If you recall the study, the Greek hero Hercules, he encountered 12 labors to restore himself to the gods, and one of them was to go past far west to collect cattle, and the westernmost point was at the Pillars of Hercules. And this was now thought to be a mountain which looked as much like a pillar as people could have imagined it to be in those times. The Rock of Gibraltar, here right on the Strait of Gibraltar, facing the strait, and behind it, the Atlantic Ocean. So this must have been what people had in mind in terms of one of the Pillars of Hercules. And across the Strait of Gibraltar in North Africa was Jebel Adras, or Jebel Musa, Moses Mountain, which could have, in people's imagination, been the second pillar of Hercules. So the idea was that Atlantis was somewhere out here, and somewhere under the ocean, since it had sunk into the ocean due to some cataclysm of some sort. So here's the reference on a larger map showing you that location. And here's one of the first maps of Europe done by Europeans, showing you that particular Mediterranean Sea here, and the possibility of Atlantis being right there. So, there's another interesting aspect to this, the Pillars of Hercules. Some think that the Pillars of Hercules symbolize in Greek columns the first use of the dollar sign and peso sign. And so, in fact, King Philip of Spain used these pillars to symbolize the Pillars of Hercules, and the scroll through it is like the dollar sign, and so we have possibly the origin of our money and our symbols for our money. So the time frame and the point of the story. This was supposed to have taken place about 9,000 BC, according to Solon and the Greek manuscripts that he read. And that's a long time ago, long before Greek civilization, yet nonetheless clear in the minds of the people who were living in Egypt. It was where people, human beings on the planet, first rose from being barbaric, that is, hunters and gatherers, to a full-blown civilization, 9,000 years BC, according to the story. And it's a place that people in their minds, even the Greeks, thought of as being the original Garden of Eden, a utopia, the perfect place to live, where everyone was full of health and wealthy, architecture was beautiful, economy and politics were unsurpassed, and it was a gem of the ocean far before the Greek and Roman civilizations. That's in their minds. And then what happened, according to the legend, was that there was some great cataclysm, some earthquake, some volcanic eruption, tsunami, whatever, caused Atlantis to sink into the sea and to forever be missing from their eyes, but there in their minds it was there somewhere. So begins the search for Atlantis. Where was it? This is an example of what people have been finding in the Mediterranean a lot. Greek columns sunk in the ocean. Well, aren't these bits of evidence that maybe some great civilization once stood above the waters and is now sunk? So, is this scientific fact, or is it just a myth? It's difficult to say because people sometimes choose to accept the story without any evidence because it's fanciful and it suits their interests and their beliefs. Or is it just a myth and not based on real fact, but just a legend created in people's minds? So let's look at some of the mythical sort of approaches that people have taken. Lots of pseudoscience has gone into this. There are whole journals published about Atlantis. And so they're filled with these kinds of stories of pseudoscience. They're just imaginative sorts of things, interpretations of little bits of evidence to meet their needs to explain Atlantis. So there's one series of kinds of beliefs called the ancient astronaut theories. These all have at their base that astronauts or aliens came to Earth sometime in the great distant past, discovered on Earth barbaric human beings simply wandering around chasing animals, and infused upon them, or within them, into them, this notion of education, of literacy, of architecture. And the aliens were responsible for the creation of this first great civilization. So ancient astronauts believed that aliens were responsible for all civilizations on the planet as we know them today. And so here's an example of what they've used. Here's a cylinder seal, clay seal found of Assyrian age, about 800 BC. And in it, they say, well, look, here are people standing on the ground, pointing up into the air at things which appear to be spaceships. Clearly, these must be aliens who have come to Earth, and they made a record of that. They haven't studied much about ancient history or Assyrian cylinder seals because they would know otherwise that these are symbols of the sun and the moon gods who they worshipped at that time. They also use this as evidence. Here's King Pakal. He's the king of Palenque in ancient Mayan history in Mexico. And they have him here. This was found as the cover to his sarcophagus in the tomb under a great pyramid in Palenque. They have him here sitting on a throne, which was probably the intent of the people who carved it. But these ancient astronaut theoreticians will say, oh no, look, he's on a console with the instruments in front of him, flying this spaceship off into the heavens, and you can see the flames coming out of the bottom. That's clearly a Mayan king flying in a spaceship. And so people who want to believe this will believe it because it suits their needs in believing that the ancient aliens were responsible for kind of civilizing these people. There are other kinds of pseudoscientific proposals. One is that of Olaf Rudbeck, about 1670, who believed, he was an anatomist and doctor in Sweden. He believed that Atlantis existed somewhere near Sweden, and he sent people out looking for Atlantis, never found it. Another was Mason Valentine's Bimini Road, about 1970. He was scuba diving off the coast of Bimini Island and discovered these interesting pillow-like rock structures at the bottom of the ocean, about 18 feet below the surface, and said, look, clearly this is a road built by the ancient peoples, the Atlanteans. What else could it be? Of course, geologists have other explanations for it. But Ignatius Donnelly believed in an antediluvian world that is before the great flood that was ruled by the Atlanteans. And he showed here in his map the areas that are light colored were all what he called Atlantis, with the central island right here. The rest of the world was all flooded. This is another scheme that people have had. And then Helen Blavatsky, a kind of occultist who did seances and things for people, she believed that Atlantis was this huge island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. You can see it there between the Asia and the Americas, and that's where Atlantis must be. And she called it Mu, or Lemuria, the fourth. There were 3 other Lemurias before that one that she proposed. There was another possibility here. The Nazis believed so much in Atlantis, and the people, the Atlanteans, that they were, he thought, that the Nazis thought, they were the originators of the Aryan peoples. And so that by going to Tibet to find the descendants, the direct descendants of the Atlanteans, they would learn more about their great civilization and their great people, which would strengthen their propaganda. Ray Brown discovered a pyramid 650 feet below the ocean, somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. This is his rendition of it, and he says, clearly this is evidence of Atlantis. Maybe not. Nikolai Seleznev thought that there was an underwater highway. He found this off the coast of Spain, this pillow rock formation. He thought clearly that was a roadway in Atlantis that proved that Atlantis did exist. And then another man, Boris Asturna, who didn't have any real photographic evidence, kind of made one up. He said, well, this is Atlantis, under the waves of the ocean. Clearly it's there, we just have to find it. So, let's look at evidence that we can find and use that as the starting point for discovering where Atlantis is, or if there is an Atlantis at all. One of the first sorts of things we look at is archaeological evidence. The first people who were hunters and gatherers who began to settle down were the Natufians about 9,000 years ago, and also at the same time, 9,600 years ago, was the city of Jericho, the oldest city in the world, the first time that we find any evidence of construction of buildings. Here are the Natufians, just a kind of a mock-up of what they must have looked like, gathering grains, but also hunting and building these kinds of first domiciles. These are about 15 feet across. We find no constructions of buildings occurring before this time, about 9,600 BC. These are not very palatial, not very exotic, but they are the first structures made with stones. And the first sorts of artwork that the Natufians were creating was these carvings out of limestone, not very handsome or lifelike, but nevertheless, at about 9,000 BC, not so much the equivalent of what Atlantis would have looked like in terms of its art in people's minds. And here's Jericho. This is a 25, 35-foot tower, which has been excavated, found in Jericho, which is about 800 feet below sea level, but in the desert, far from any Atlantic Ocean. Santorini, the Thera eruption. This is one possibility that may have left this notion in people's minds about what happened. Santorini is on the itinerary of a lot of cruises in the Greek islands. It's a volcanic island. It's located right here, south and east of the Greek mainland, north of Crete, right there. Well, in about 1600 BC, more or less, for 50 years either way, there was a massive volcanic eruption on Thera. It blew its stack, one of the largest eruptions in the history of the planet that we have any records of. So much so that it sent out tsunamis and tidal waves and ash and hot rock, and the island was reduced to this little straggling perimeter with the main part of the island having sunk into the sea. Perfect. That's what may have happened to Atlantis. So that's why maybe that would be a good sort of notion, idea. In fact, when the eruption took place, the tsunami basically destroyed the northern coast of Crete, where the Minoan civilization lived, the highest civilization, actually even equivalent to that of Egypt. Black Sea deluge, another thought. Robert Ballard thought that the Black Sea, around the north coast of Turkey and east of Bulgaria and Romania, right just off the tip of what what is today Istanbul, was once much more full, which had a much larger basin, and there was a collapse of an earthen dam, which allowed the Black Sea to flow into the Mediterranean, inundating the Mediterranean, causing the levels of the sea to rise, which would have flooded any cities in the Mediterranean. That could have remained in the minds of people. This, of course, didn't happen about 18,000 years ago, which may have not affected too many people at that time. And this is an idea that maybe, in fact, this is a landmass that would have been exposed in the Mediterranean, and it's thought that maybe Atlantis was right there. Another interesting idea. Helike is this town in Greece that you can see today underwater. In fact, traveling along the coast of Turkey myself, I've seen many of these buildings under the surfaces of the water, the walls, rock walls of buildings. Well, this occurred in about 300 BC when an earthquake occurred and the whole land subsided, flooding all the towns along the coast. That would have left a memory in people's minds that the sinking of civilization into the sea. And we have evidence today of that. And then there's some hypotheses that this may have occurred in the Western Mediterranean on the coast of Spain, near a place called Tartessos, where there are today marshes which have flooded due to rising sea levels. Now, a couple more before we wind this up. Spartel Bank, another place in the Straits of Gibraltar, here's Spartel Bank, which is underneath the sea. At one point in time, it was above the sea level, and when sea levels rose, it flooded. Many people who lived there may have fled and left this story with others about the fact that their civilization had sunk and everything was destroyed along with it. The Atlantic Ocean region, there are a lot of places that may fill this candidacy for Atlantis, near the Azores, the Canary Islands, and the Cape Verde Islands, which are off the northwest coast of Africa. Here's a little photograph of the bottom of the sea near the Canary Islands, which these pseudoscientists say clearly gives you evidence that there are walls here. This was a city, but in fact, these depressions in the bottom of the sea silt were made by propellers of ships going back and forth over the top of this area. All right, so there are dozens of magical reconstructions of Atlantis, and I can show you a few of them. They've been drawn and artfully decorated by the minds of people who want you to think what their belief in Atlantis is. Is it this one with the mountains in the background? Is it? In every case, they have circular sorts of canals surrounding populated rings, and at the center is the temple and the main center of government. And then these canals are always connected to the greater sea, which allowed them to have trade connections with the whole world. Of course, the rest of the world was not as civilized, but nevertheless, it caused them to become very popular, very important, and very successful in the world. Here's another one showing Greek architecture. Of course, this Greek architecture didn't exist until about 500 or 600 BC. That's a long time after. Another possible example. There's so many of these pictures of what Atlantis looked like above the water and below. So, we tend to look at Atlanticism as a kind of a spiritual movement. So it's an attempt to reclaim the mother culture. Like the mother to all cultures on the earth were supposedly this one, which was a perfect, pristine culture from which all cultures have evolved. We learned what we have learned today only because the Atlanteans gave us this information, this education, this insight. And that's one idea, that it's the mother culture, and so we need to search for it for that reason alone. There's this notion of the spiritual supermarket as well. There's a great deal of demand or desire out there for people to have mystical interpretations of things that they can't see and have read about somewhere in ancient manuscripts. And so it feeds that marketplace. And there are lots of people who go on world tours to find Atlantis by individuals who think they know a lot about it. And then this notion of the theories of space visitors who came and changed the world, and they're responsible for it, in fact. But the bottom line, I think, in this case, is that by accepting Atlanticism, accepting the perfection of the earliest society as a progenitor of all further and later societies, including our own, doesn't give credit to the individual peoples and these other societies along the way for individualism, creativity, and their own ability as human beings to create perfect societies or societies that are beautiful and successful. So I think that maybe we need to give more credit to people who are living on the earth in the past recent few thousand years, and not so much credit to visitors from outer space. Thanks very much. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Collins, thank you very much. This was very interesting. Do you believe that there was Atlantis?
The jury's out. No, I don't believe in the pseudoscientific sort of explanations of Atlantis. I like to start with science first. If you can show me a city under the ocean with all these incredible achievements that is dated to before the Greek time, like maybe before 1000 BC, the first Greek town started appearing 1000 BC. Athens is about that old as a little village. Then I might think that if it's older than that, then it could be Egyptian, because the Egyptians go back to about 3000 BC. So it depends on what the artifacts look like, and a lot of science has to go into it, a lot of research. So, no. Any other questions from my audience? Thank you very much for coming. Hope you come to the next talk.